Okay, we're going to get started. All right, good evening, everybody. And thank you for coming to Hofstra's 16th annual Darwin Day celebration. It's hard to believe that I've been doing this for 16 years. This is proof that if you do something pretty well once, you are doomed to do it again and again and again until you die. So see you again next year for number 17. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12th in 1809, and Saturday will be his 213th birthday. Each year, on or around his birthday, events like this one are held to honor his life and his work. And you may ask, well, why Darwin? Why don't we do a Newton Day or an Einstein Day or a Curie Day? Certainly Darwin's documentation of evolution and his discovery of evolution's principal mechanism, natural selection, are unmatched scientific accomplishments. But the main reason we choose to commemorate Darwin is for what he represents, which is the power of science to transcend prejudice, myth, and magical thinking, and a responsibility to see the world as it really is and to accept what science shows us to be real, even if it makes us a little bit uncomfortable. And, do I need to tell anyone here how important this message is right now during the time of COVID? Science has proven again and again that it can provide very powerful tools for meeting society's challenges, the pandemic being one of many of these challenges. Yet here we are in the second decade of the 21st century, and the very enterprise of science is under constant attack for providing answers that contradict political beliefs or religious sensibilities. Darwin devoted his life to pursuing a truth that he knew would upset mankind's very sense of place in the universe and likely cost him a few friends, which it did. But he kept on working at it because the evidence was undeniable. So this is why we gather once a year to celebrate the life and the vision of Charles Darwin. We also gather for cake because it is a birthday celebration. And even though we're in COVID protocols, we still get to have our cake. You get to take a slice home with you. So the birthday celebration lives on. Tonight we are very honored to host Dr. Doug Futuyma, who is a widely respected evolutionary biologist and someone who has done very important research on speciation and coevolution. He is the author of two of the probably most widely used textbooks on evolution. I'm pretty sure when I took evolution in graduate school, I remember the cover of the book. I was using Dr. Futuyma's book. He's written other books as well, including a very interesting book on creationism and evolution. He is a member, Dr. Futuyma is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University, research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1997, he was presented with the Sewell Wright Award by the American Society of Naturalists for, quote, making fundamental contributions to the conceptual unification of the biological sciences. And in 2012, he was presented with the Joseph Leidy Award by the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And I just want to point out that previous recipients of the Leidy Award have included Ernst Mayr, arguably one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, James Bond, the ornithologist, not the secret agent, and Peter and Rosemary Grant, which anyone who's familiar with evolution in the Galapagos Islands knows who they are. Last year, Dr. Futuyma published a new book uniting the two passions of his life, evolution and birding. The book is titled How Birds Evolve. We have copies available for sale and autographing after the talk. And how birds evolve is the subject of tonight's lecture. So without further ado, with immense pleasure, I give you Dr. Doug Futuyma.
Forgive me if I remove the mask, I hope. Thank you, Brett, very much, and thank you, for inviting me. That's very kind of you. And thank you all for coming. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be looking at a room with real people in it, instead of a screen with one or two small images of people. If anyone is watching this remotely, thank you also for coming coming virtually. As Brett mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist. That's what I do. That's what I teach. My research has not been on birds. I have no official qualifications as an ornithologist. The research I've done has been on insects and their relationships to plants that they eat, and a few other things as well, but that's been my main focus. But as he mentioned, I've been an active birder, I think starting at the age of 11 or 12, variably active after that, but for the last 30 years, I have to say, pretty passionate about it. It's taken me to a lot of countries, and I've seen a lot of bird species, and I got this idea of using birds in a book that would also communicate the basic ideas and principles of evolution and how evolutionary scientists actually study evolution. Because it's not just a matter of looking at fossils. There's a lot more to it. In fact, I would say the vast, probably 5% at most of people who call themselves evolutionary biologists do paleontology. The others are, as you will see, doing genetics and behavior and ecology and all kinds of things in an evolutionary context. Because evolution, really, since Darwin, has been kind of the grand unifying theme of biology. Why? Because everything has evolved. All life, we know now, comes from one common ancestor. And that means that whether you're looking at an insect or an alga or a mushroom or a human, they've all come from one common ancestor, which means that all of their features, everything from their DNA sequence to their capacity for different behaviors, basically everything is a product of some evolutionary history. So let me start let me start here. This is a photo I took in the Andes in Bolivia a few years ago on a birding tour. And I wasn't the first person interested in natural history to go there. Young Charles Darwin, pictured here, went there in his 20s when he was on the voyage of the Beagle, which stopped along the coast of South America in many places. And he did many inland excursions, including not into Bolivia, but into the Andes in Chile. And of course he didn't see electric poles then and so forth then, but otherwise he saw pretty much what you see here. And he also saw this bird on the left, an Andean goose, and he probably saw the bird on the right, the Andean flicker, which you will notice is very similar to flickers around here, if you know what a flicker is. It's a kind of woodpecker. But when he was in the Pampas of Argentina, he did see a very close relative, the Campo flicker. And in The Origin of Species, he points out, he says, what could be, now the background to this, of course, is everyone believed that species had been individually created by God and endowed with all kinds of marvelous characteristics which would be exactly what they need to function and to survive. And so eyes were created for birds and for humans, for the function of seeing, and likewise wings were bestowed on birds so that they could fly, and so on. And so Darwin says in The Origin of Species, he says, what could be more clear but that the webbed feet of ducks and geese are made for swimming? But he says in the Andean mountains, there are geese, and he was talking about the Andean goose here. He says there are geese in the Andean mountains, which, I'm sure this light is working There are geese that never go near water, or hardly ever in water. And he remarked of the flicker that he had seen in the pampas of Argentina, where he says, hardly a tree grows. There is a woodpecker, which in every detail of its anatomy, its flight behavior, even its call, is, closely resembles our green woodpecker in Britain. And he points out that it has features such as the pointed tail feathers that you might see here, which are clearly adaptations for climbing trees, but there's hardly a tree to climb in the pampas. And what he drew from this was, and he says, this makes sense that they would have these characteristics if they have descended from ancestors that were standard water-dwelling geese and standard that Andean geese have come from, from web-toed ancestors. Okay. The other great theme in Darwin is, how has this happened? What have been the causes of these changes? What have been the causes by which an ancestral species splits into multiple descendants which evolve different characteristics? And his answer to this was, and again, one of the most brilliant and most important ideas that anyone has ever had in the history of the world. His answer to that was the idea of, well, I'll come to the answer in the next slide. I've forgotten this would exemplify here the two great questions, okay? Here we have just 7 of the 300 plus species of hummingbirds. And you look at them and you see that they have different bills. One of them up there has a deeply curved bill. This one, the second from the left at the top, is sort of a little upturned at the top. So they have different kinds of bills. They have different kinds of coloration. They have different kinds of ornaments. You've got this crazy long tail here at the lower left on the red-tailed comet, or over at the right on the violet-tailed sylph. They differ in size. So the two upper birds on the left are about a quarter of the size of the giant hummingbird that's, it's sitting here on someone's hand. And why is it that these things have come to be so different in these different characteristics? And his answer, his brilliant hypothesis for accounting for that, was what he called natural selection. And here on the left, you see the basic principle of natural selection, which is so simple and at the same time so profound. So you have two kinds of organisms of the same species, and one is black and one is red. And the red type simply multiplies faster from generation to generation than the black type. Why? Either there's a lower death rate, it survives better, it survives to make babies, or when it does have babies, it has more of them. It has a higher reproductive rate. Okay, and given that if there's a fairly consistent difference between two genetic types in a population in the rate at which they multiply, then one eventually takes over. And that is all other things being equal, that's a mathematical certainty. And of course, we see that playing out right now in this horrible virus. The Omicron virus has essentially taken over to a large extent, replacing the other variants because it multiplies faster. It is able somehow to spread faster to more people than the Delta did before it. Okay, so this is a powerful thing that basically then explains if one genetic type has a feature that somehow or another enables it to reproduce more prolifically or to survive more effectively, then that type may very well take over the population. Now, this idea of natural selection was something that Darwin never. It was a pure hypothesis. He had zero evidence for it. No one had ever documented, a process, a difference of this kind, happening generation by generation among different types within a species. Okay, but so for him, it was a powerful explanatory hypothesis, but no one had actually documented it in nature. But since then, it has been abundantly shown and abundantly documented. And on the right, you see a very famous example of this. And this is evolutionary changes in beak size of the finch that's on the left, the medium ground finch in the Galapagos Island. And we're looking here at the average bill size over the course of 35 years, studied by Peter and Rosemary Grant year by year by year on one island in the Galapagos Island. And what you see is, and I should back up and say that this was a finch that fed mostly on the fairly small seeds of a certain species of plant. And early on, you see there was a drought, and you see the beak size drop down. I'm not quite sure why it dropped down, but there was a drought, and that species of plant didn't reproduce very well, and then the finches mostly started eating somewhat larger seeds of another kind of plant. And that selected for those individuals that had larger, more powerful bills. Okay? And so what you see then, early on, between 1975 and 1980, is an increase in the average bill size because individuals were surviving better if they had a bigger bill and could feed on these larger seeds, and basically they had kids who inherited larger bill size. So this is the important principle of inheritance. And then you see that after a while, as the original plant became more common and was producing seed, you see the bill slide declining and going back to its original level, which it maintains pretty constantly for about 15 years or so. And then at the end, you see the average bill size drop down in the 1970s there. And why is that? It's because the bird on the right, the large ground finch with this gigantic bill, which feeds on larger, harder seeds. Bill is an adaptation for feeding on larger, harder seeds. Basically, that finch invaded the island and multiplied and started depleting the larger seed supply, and for that matter, some of the seeds that the finch had been eating before, the medium finch, and basically the surviving finches, the medium ground finches that had smaller bills that would feed on smaller seeds that the large-billed ground finch doesn't eat, they had an advantage. So this is one of many examples of natural selection in action. And between Darwin's descriptions of birds and the origin of species and work like the Grant's work in the Galapagos, are two of many, many, many cases in which birds have been studied, and been able to cast light on evolution hypotheses about how evolution has happened over time and what the causes of evolutionary change are. So birds, more than anything except genetics of fruit flies, birds more than any other group have really contributed empirically to our understanding of what's really happening from an evolutionary point of view out there in nature. Okay. And there's a lot to explain out there. Like the sword-billed hummingbird, one of the most staggeringly impressive birds that I've ever seen. I mean, it just takes your breath away. And the question is, why would a bird evolve such an insanely long beak? I mean, this is crazy. And guess who had an idea that would explain that? Good old Charles Darwin. But he wasn't specifically talking about sword-billed hummingbirds. He was talking about this orchid that you see on the left. Darwin studied orchids in a big way, those that were being grown mostly in greenhouses in London. And they got hold of an orchid in Madagascar with this very, very, very long spur that has nectar at the bottom. And Darwin predicted, he said, there must be a sphinx moth because this is white and it's a very, very narrow tube. It is adapted to basically be pollinated by sphinx moths, which have a very, very long, slender tongue. And sure enough, about 50 years later, this moth was discovered on the left, which you see has a proboscis that is more than twice the length of its body, and that indeed feeds on and pollinates that orchid. And Darwin then came up with a hypothesis about why there should have been this extraordinary exaggeration. And as he says, as the proboscis evolved to be longer in a moth to obtain nectar, those individual plants which had the longest nectar tubes, and which consequently compelled the moths to insert their proboscis up to the very base, so that their face, which is where the pollen would be into the flower, and he said, and the pollen then would be able to access the stigma. Okay, he said this would compel the moths to insert their proboscis up to the very base. Those plants would be fertilized and yield the most seed, and the seedlings would generally inherit longer nectaries, and so it would be in successive generations of the plant and moth. Okay? That basically, longer nectar tubes mean selection on the moth to have a longer tongue or longer proboscis, and if the proboscis gets too long, the moth doesn't have to stick its face all the way in, and so those plants will be pollinated better that do require the moth to stick its face all the way in by having their nectar farther away down a longer nectary. Well, no one has studied. And here's the sword-billed hummingbird again, and one of its main nectar sources on the right, a passion flower, which has this very, very long corolla tube. So no one has actually studied it in the sword-billed hummingbird, unfortunately, but they have studied it in this extraordinary South African fly, which you see on the left, has a proboscis about 4 times the length of its body. And it feeds on very long tubed flowers, like this a member of the iris family. And what you see are data collected by a South African researcher on the right. At the top, you would expect those flies that have the longest proboscis to be able to consume the most nectar. They could basically access, nectar even in the longest flowers. And sure enough, even though there's a whole lot of scatter in the data, each of those points is the amount of nectar consumed by one fly in relation to how long its tongue is. And and even though there's a lot of scatter, it's pretty messy. Nonetheless, on average, longer-tongued flies do get more nectar, just as Darwin predicted. And as he predicted down at the bottom, we see the number of pollen grains that have been deposited on flowers that differ in their length. And sure enough, flowers that are longer, have a longer tube, do get more pollen on them. So exactly as Darwin predicted, that basically this means that if you're a plant, you're better off having a longer nectar tube because you're more likely to be pollinated. And likewise, the fly is more likely to get food if it has a long tongue. So that's examples of natural selection and how it can explain things. And one of the things that it can explain, but requires quite a bit of study, is that sometimes natural selection doesn't just favor one type, which is like the best type of all. There are various ways in which natural selection can actually maintain 2 or more different types of individuals in the same population. And there are a number of different ways in which that can happen. And one of them is illustrated here by the black-bellied seedcracker, a beautiful finch that I was really thrilled to see in Ghana, because I had already read about this research on the black-bellied seedcracker, and sure enough, there it was. So at the left, what you see is that some birds have relatively small bills and others have relatively large bills. And as you might suspect from the Galapagos finch story, those bills would adapt those birds to feed on different kinds of seeds, small versus large seeds. And that is exactly what they do. And on the right, what you see is a graph in which the green represents the entire distribution of biddle length, the number of birds that had mandible lengths, various lengths, when they were young birds and have a fully developed bill. And the blue shows those that actually succeeded in surviving to become reproductive adults and successfully reproduce. And what you see is that basically birds that had small bills did relatively well. They survived. Both those that had really big bills survived, and the ones in between by and large didn't. Okay? So this is a case in which natural selection can explain why there is variety. And obviously, this is a big question to ask when it comes to humans. And we have so many characteristics that are so amazingly variable, both among different human populations in different parts of the world and within single populations. And and one of the things you'd like to know is, why isn't everyone the same, right? I mean, one of the most important really important features of humans is our beautiful variety, in every way, and there's a whole lot of study on humans, of course, that's directed at understanding that variation. Here's another example: the common cuckoo in Europe and across into Asia. This is a really interesting bird. I saw this individual bird, and so did my friend Bob, who's in the audience here. But we didn't see it in England. We saw it in Rhode Island, of all places. Sometimes birds just seem to get off course when they're migrating or looking for a place to settle down, and they can end up in crazy places. So this is one of the very few common cuckoos ever seen in eastern North America, and it turned up in Rhode Island, and everyone from miles around, including me, went up to see it. Well, the interesting thing about the common cuckoo is that there are a number of different genetic types of females which lay their eggs, each of which lays her eggs specifically in the nest of a certain species of bird. These are brood parasites. Okay, they lay their egg in the nest of another bird, and the host, the rightful owner of the nest, doesn't discriminate between the different nestlings of its own species versus the cuckoo nestling. And often the cuckoo nestling will actually essentially kill the rightful owner, inhabitants of the nest by basically tossing them out of the nest. Anyway, so the adult birds feed this parasitic bird and rear it. Okay. But the adult birds can tell an egg that's different from their own eggs and will toss out the foreign eggs. And so in most cases, so what we have in the case of the cuckoo is that different genetic types lay differently patterned and colored eggs. Okay? And on the left you see the eggs of 6 species of birds that are parasitized by cuckoos. And on the right is a typical egg of the cuckoo type which parasitizes that particular host species. And then the mimicry isn't perfect, but it's pretty close. Look at the lower two in particular. You've got one that's almost brown and one that's very heavily speckled. And the cuckoo egg looks very much like the host egg. The one exception is the third one down, which is the egg of the dunnock. And the dunnock, for some reason, doesn't discriminate among eggs. Apparently it just doesn't notice or doesn't care, whatever. But anyway, this is a lovely example, again, of how you can have different genetic types, each of which is highly fit, is adapted to a single aspect of the environment that's different from the environment, in this case, the host bird, different from the environment to which another genotype is adapted. And so this is an example of some of the kind of thing that a lot of evolutionary biologists study. As I said, they're not studying fossils. They're interested in what are the actual processes of evolution. How is natural selection operating? What is it about birds that natural selection can explain? And one of the things it can sometimes explain is variation within the same species. Okay. If any of you are familiar with any local birds, and especially if you have a bird feeder, you probably have white-throated sparrows coming to your feeder right now, all winter long. And if you look carefully, you'll see that some of them have bright white stripes on the head, and in others they are tan stripes. And those are genetically different types maintained by natural selection. The story there is more complicated than I want to spend time on, but if anyone wants to ask after, you may. Okay, so moving on, and I'm afraid I should have been way ahead of where I am now. Moving on, we're interested in the origins of bird diversity. And just as in the hummingbirds, here's another case. These are tropical American wood creepers. And what you see is this enormous range of types from the upper left, this wedge-billed woodpecker, which is a small bird with a little short bill that's slightly upturned, all the way through these different types in which the bill is longer or shorter, stouter or thinner. At the second from right is the long-billed woodcreeper, just a staggering bird that probes mostly in bromeliads, these tank epiphytes. And at the right, this amazing red-billed scythebill I mean, just look at that bill. And so, so we're interested in how this diversity comes into existence. Well, one obvious way that it comes into existence is that there are different kinds of resources out there, like probing into the hollows of bamboo, or into bromeliads, or just looking under bark to pick off insects. There are different resources out there that are best handled by different bill types. But another aspect is that you get competition between species. And Darwin predicted that if two species are using the same kind of resource, natural selection will favor those individuals which are using a different resource from what the other species is using, because that resource basically wouldn't be as exhausted by the competing species. And so he said natural selection would favor a tendency for two species that are very similar to one another to become different as they adapt to using somewhat different resources that each can call its own. And one example is in this Titicaca grebe, and this is a photo I took. I saw it in Bolivia. This is a flightless grebe, which is a water bird that feeds on fish or crustaceans, and this is only in Lake Titicaca, high in the Andes of Peru and Bolivia. Okay, and here we have a messy-looking slide, and I wish this pointer worked, honestly. Oh wait, maybe it does. No, it doesn't. Seem to work. Anyway, so this is a fairly old study, and what is shown here is on the vertical axis is the length of the bill of individual birds. And all these data points, each one is the bill length of an individual grebe. And on the horizontal, you're going from the north to the south on a transect from 500 kilometers north of Lake Junín, Lake Junín, to about 2,000 kilometers south of Lake Junín. And right there over toward the right, at about 1,000 kilometers, you see the position of Lake Titicaca. And the upper cluster of points that are hollow circles, those are the bill lengths of various Titicaca grebes, the one that I just showed you. Okay. And the lower black points show the bill lengths of specimens of the white tufted grebe, which is the photograph on the left. And the white tufted grebe is widely distributed all through lakes, all through this region. And what you see is that the bill length of the white tufted grebe over at 0 at Lake Junín is fairly high. And then as you move southward toward Titicaca, there aren't too many grebe samples there. And then in Titicaca, they have smaller beaks. And then as you continue further south away from Titicaca, you see that these grebes have longer beaks again. And what's going on? What's going on is that specifically in Titicaca, where they got the smaller beaks, they're different from elsewhere. And that, of course, is where they have to contend with the Titicaca grebe. So there they have a competitor, and what the white-tufted grebe has done is to essentially evolve to use a different resource. They're using smaller crustaceans in the water rather than the small fish and medium-sized fish that the Titicaca grebe, with its long beak, is feeding on. So again, a beautiful example of how we can show that species evolve in response to one another, in response to competition with one another. And again, Darwin was right. Okay. Now, some of the most curious features of birds, and not just birds, but many fishes, insects, and other things as well, is really, really crazy characteristics and colorations. This is one of the birds in the world that I most wanted to see, and let me tell you, when I finally saw it, that was like this incredible, never to be forgotten experience. This is Wilson's bird of paradise. It's quite a small bird, that size maybe of a cardinal or a little bit bigger, and it lives just on one or two small islands off the west coast of Papua New Guinea. And this is a male Wilson's bird of paradise. Look at this crazy thing. The top of the head is bare-skinned. It's bald, brilliant, electric blue bare skin. And then there's this big patch of yellow feathers, and then red feathers and red wings. And look at that tail.
It has, it has some normal tail feathers, and then two tail feathers that are just insanely, no way you could use them for flying or for helping, for steering in flight. Why do you get these kinds of things? Here are some other, it's just one of the birds of paradise. All these insanely crazy birds. The one at the upper left, King of Saxony's bird of paradise. It has one plume on each side of the head that's,
that is twice as long as the body, and it looks like it's made of plastic, and it waves them around like crazy antennae at the same time that it's calling. And this at the lower left, the bluebird of paradise, hanging upside down when the male is courting and beating his wings and making crazy sounds. And the lower right, a parotia, which does a dance that you have to see to believe. Or what you should see is David Attenborough's films on the birds of paradise. Fabulous. Anyway, what can account for this, for both the variety and just these amazing characteristics that obviously do not help in survival? Again, one of Darwin's ideas, for which he had zero evidence, it was only an idea, but he devoted half a book to this idea. The book was The Descent of Man, published in 1871. And half of The Descent of Man is about what he calls selection in relation to sex, in which he said that many features are not adaptive in terms of the ecological environment, but rather they have evolved, in the case of these weird characteristics, especially of male birds and fish and so forth, they've evolved either because they help the male basically battle other males when competing for mates, competing for females, or they're actively preferred by females. And it turns out, and this idea that the females would exert choice and choose among different males was, basically it wasn't taken seriously for 80 years, really. But since then, we know that that's exactly what happens. So this is the magnificent, wonderful, long-tailed widow bird in eastern Africa, who nests in grasslands. And at the top, you see histograms showing I should say that a male can attract several females who build nests in his territories, and he mates with them. And so the question is, which males are going to get the most mates, because those males will have the most offspring. And if those males have some particular characteristic, then that is going to be inherited by their offspring, and that characteristic will then tend to become more and more prevalent in the species population. Okay, so what we see is 4 groups of males, and at the top they all have pretty much the same number of females. And then for the next breeding season, Malte Anderson went and clipped off half the tail of some birds, so they had very, very short tails, and he pasted those clippings onto the tail of normal birds, so they had tails that were much longer than normal. And at the bottom, you see the number of females that each of those types got, compared to unmanipulated birds with normal tails in the middle, those two bars in the middle. And each bar shows the number of females on average. And what you see is the ones with shorter tails didn't attract as many females as normal males do, and that's no surprise. But the ones that had totally abnormal, exaggeratedly long tails attracted more females than normal males do. So there's something about these females which is programmed to really go crazy when they see a male with a really dramatically longer tail. Now the question is, and now we know that this has been documented in many other species of birds as well as other animals. So now the question is, why would females be somehow or another programmed to prefer males that have exaggerated, crazy traits like this? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And there are several hypotheses, and one could easily give a whole lecture on this. And if you've read Richard Crumb's book about the evolution of beauty, he champions one idea, and he's in the minority in championing that idea. What's probably the most popular idea right now, which does have some evidence, is that males that have highly exaggerated features, that they're healthy enough to be able to produce those features. And so there may be something about their genetic constitution that makes them exceptionally vigorous,
or maybe resistant to parasites or to diseases or something. And so they're healthy enough to really, to be able to produce those crazy plumes and engage in all these crazy behaviors. And there's some evidence for that in a few birds, two of which may be familiar to you. So at the top, you see the familiar barn swallow, which is found in North America and across Eurasia. And it turns out that in North America, females prefer males that have a darker breast, a darker reddish breast. Whereas you see on the right, in Eurasia, they have white breasts. And in Eurasia, it turns out that females there really prefer males that have longer tail streamers, those long tail feathers. And it also turned out that the preferred type of male has basically fewer feather lice, and in at least one of those cases, they have nests that have fewer nest mites. Okay? So there seems to be something about those males that is resistant to these kinds of parasites. Which then says, well, then it would make sense, of course, for females to prefer a male that isn't heavily parasitized and isn't going to be transmitting parasites to the kids. Somewhat related to that, or in the same vein, is the common yellowthroat, a very, very common breeding bird here, kind of warbler. And a couple has studied them both in Wisconsin and in New York. And in Wisconsin, they found that females prefer males that have a particularly large, dark black mask. And in New York, they don't care about the mask so much, but they prefer males that have an exceptionally bright yellow throat. And the investigators looked at part of the immune system, the major histocompatibility locus, which can have many, many genes. And basically, if you have more histocompatibility genes, it means you are potentially resistant to more different kinds of parasites or pathogens. Potentially, there's some evidence for that, and Maureen can probably tell me more about that at the end if I'm wrong. But anyway, so it turns out that there's at least a correlation between a potential, disease resistance aspect of the male, which he might transmit to his offspring, and the characteristic that those local females prefer. Okay? And I think these cases that I've shown here are particularly interesting because here you have a case where different geographic populations of the species are somewhat different, and in which the male characteristics are differently preferred by females in these two different areas, which begins to give you an idea of maybe why different related species of birds have different colorations or songs or other characteristics in their males. Why should the common yellow throat and the closely related mourning warbler have different facial characteristics and to some extent ventral color pattern, and maybe that has to do with divergent preferences of their females, and maybe that had to do with those characteristics signaling better health in different ways. Okay. I'm going to have to run through an awful lot of really wonderful stuff very quickly. I hope you'll be patient with me, and I'll try to finish more or less on time. Because what I want to switch now to is the other big question about evolution that Darwin and we can ask, which is, what has happened?
What's been the history of evolution? Where did all these different birds come from? What's the history by which humans became different from the apes that were their ancestors, the common ancestors of humans and chimpanzees? And there are two ways of exploring that history. One is the fossil record, which is in many cases not very useful. Like the bird fossil record is not all that rich, although it has some very interesting things in it. But the other way is basically to reconstruct the family tree of different species, what we call a phylogeny. And this is an example of a phylogeny, and in this case, of 7 species of warblers, very common warblers, most of which we see around here. The top 2 are Western species, but the rest of them you can see here in Long Island, at least during their migration. And I should say that this book has wonderful black and white illustrations by Lucy Betty Nash and her husband Stephen Nash, who are professional biological illustrators, and there's this beautiful pen and ink work that they've done. Anyway, what is shown here
is basically a series of forks. And time runs from at the right end is the present day, and as you go leftward, you're going back in time to 4.5 million years in this case. And at 4.5 million years, that little projection on the left shows an ancestral species, which at about 4.5 million years split into two descendant species, one of which ultimately gave rise to the Cape May warbler at the bottom, and the other of those two species was the progenitor of, it itself split into two species, and one of those at the top gave rise to the three warblers at the top, the hermit townsends and black-throated green warblers, and the other product of that split, again, it split into the ancestor of the black-throated blue warbler, the second from the bottom, and the ancestor of those other two, the chestnut-sided and yellow warblers. And so basically this is a family tree in which the shorter the distance between a fork on the tree and the species that are at the ends of that fork, the shorter that distance is, the more recent the ancestor is. And as you go back in time, you have basically longer distance along the tree to find the common ancestor of any two species that are living today. Okay. How do we know how many million years ago these warblers diverged? That gets really complicated, but to put it in this, oversimplify greatly, the more different their DNA sequences are, the longer it's been since they split from a common ancestor, because there's been more time for more and more mutational differences to separate, to cause the DNA sequences to become different. Okay, so this is a phylogeny, and it basically, and I should tell you that that inferring a phylogeny sometimes can be really hard. There are a whole bunch of reasons why it's not necessarily all that simple, but there are also ways of testing how much confidence you can have in postulating particular relationships. Okay, so the hermit and the townsends and black-throated green warblers are more closely related to one another. They have more recent common ancestor than they have in common with the other warblers, to which they are more distantly related. So that's a phylogeny. And the cool thing about phylogenies is not just that now you know who's related to whom, but you can actually use that phylogeny to make inferences about really interesting things in the evolutionary past. And so here's a great big phylogeny. This is only half. This is a gigantic phylogeny based on a lot of DNA sequence information of essentially all the families of birds in the world. And this is only half of them because there's another whole page which is all the perching birds, all the songbirds. Okay. And here it is, and you can't see it, but I can see that the time scale, which here goes from bottom to top instead of left to right, the time scale goes back a little over 70 million years. 70 million years. Okay? That's 4 million years before the great extinction event that was caused probably by an asteroid collision with the Earth. Marked the end of the non-avian dinosaurs, all the dinosaurs that weren't birds. So back to 70 billion years, and I just want to point out then that as far as we can tell, all the living birds we have today stem from an ancestor around 70 million years ago. Give or take a few million years. Okay. Now, what can we do with this? Here is a conundrum, or maybe it's an enigma. Okay, these are all the so-called paleognathous birds, and it's a relatively small group separated by, and it's long known based on anatomy and also DNA. We know that this is one group of birds, one branch of the bird tree, separated from all the other birds. Okay. These birds include what are called the ratites, the great, usually mostly very large flightless birds. The ostrich in Africa, to its right, rheas in South America, to its right, this magnificent cassowary. I was thrilled to see one of these in New Guinea. Underneath the cassowary is the Australian emu. At the lower right is a lesser spotted kiwi, another thrilling experience. Oh, you have to ask me about that one. In New Zealand, that's a small bird. All these others have been giants. Above the kiwi at the upper right is a moa, one of quite a few species of moas that inhabited New Zealand until they were basically all eaten by the Maoris. And then you'll see a skeleton there, which is an elephant bird in Madagascar, also extinct quite recently, again, also probably due to humans. And at the lower left, you see a bird that you may not have heard of, which is a tinamou. And this is a group of rather small, kind of chicken-like birds in tropical America, Central America and South America. And that's an important bird. Now, the interesting question to ask, of course, about these big flightless birds is, how did they're all related to one another, how did they get, if they had a common ancestor somewhere, how did its descendants that don't have wings get to Africa, South America, New Zealand, and Australia, which are separated by ocean? And the old idea, until rather recently, was, well, those continents weren't always separated by ocean. There was a great big landmass called Gondwana that basically started to break up back around 270 million years ago. But until relatively recently, South America was still connected to Antarctica. Antarctica was warm, it had forests, it used to have dinosaurs or whatever. So maybe these birds just sort of walked, across Antarctica between Australia and South America, and maybe they could somehow walk from South America to Africa because those used to be united. And that was the going explanation. Here's this phylogeny in which you have all these, the tinamous, forget the tinamous for a moment, but here we have all these flightless birds coming from a common ancestor, which lost the ability to fly. So this is the former hypothesis until recently, based largely on a few anatomical characteristics that basically told us that all of these flightless birds, are related to one another. Which they are, but not in quite this same way. Now, there was a problem with that idea of how those birds got to all those different land masses, and the problem is, if you look at a map of the world in the late Cretaceous, 90 million years ago, those southern land masses were already quite well separated. Africa is totally separated. South America is close to Antarctica, but disconnected from it. And Australia was about to take off and become totally separated. And that's at 90 million years ago, and it's still another 20 million years until we have the common ancestor of all those gigantic birds. So by 70 million years ago, which is when you start to get the divergence of those birds, by 70 million years ago, the land masses were basically too far apart from one another for birds to have walked from one to another. So how did they get there? The answer was that they flew. And this is where those tinamous come in. Because now with DNA evidence, and this has now been shown by at least 3 different research groups, and they all agree, based on the DNA, the tinamous aren't just some separate branch from all those gigantic, flightless birds. The tinamous actually are right smack in the middle of them. And the tinamous can fly. That's the critical thing about tinamous. They don't fly much, but when they have to fly, they fly. And now, so what I've done in this picture is to show in red the ancestry of the tinamous. So start with the tinamous, overlined at the right, and go down to the tinamous to the first branch, which is the common ancestor of tinamous and moas, which turn out to be their closest relative. We know because this DNA has been extracted from moa bones. Okay. And so there we are. The common ancestor of tinamous and moas must have been able to fly because tinamous can fly. So that means that moas lost the ability to fly. Okay? There was a change there in the evolution of the moas. At some point, they lost the ability to fly. But the ancestor of the moas could fly. It might have been able to fly to New Zealand, which is where the moas live. Continue from that branch and go left, and you come, follow the red branch, and you come to a branching point that gives rise, on the one hand, to the tinamous and moas, but at the top, it gives rise to the elephant birds, the kiwis, and the emus. And Well, none of them can fly, but the common ancestor of their common ancestor with the tinamou must have been able to fly because tinamous can fly. So that means that that branch at the top, where you see that elongate gray triangle on the branch, that somewhere in there, that ancestor lost the ability to fly. And it gave rise to the elephant birds, the kiwis, and the emus, which inherited flightlessness. But at least the kiwis and the emus and the cassowaries are in pretty much the same place. So you can certainly see how they could have flown there. Not sure about the elephant birds, I must say. Continue that line again to the left, and it zigzags downward, okay? And then you have basically the common ancestor of all those birds at the top against the moas, which is the second from the bottom. There's the common ancestor of all those birds and the moas. But all those birds include the tinamous. So the common ancestor of all those birds, including the tinamous, the common ancestor of them and the moas must have been able to fly. And the moas lost the ability to fly. So far we have 3 independent evolutionary events in which birds became gigantic and lost the ability to fly independently. And do the same thing again, and what you see is at the bottom, the leftmost fork there, at the bottom you see the ostrich, which is the first branch from all the rest of them, and the ancestor of the ostrich also must have been able to fly. So we have then at least probably 4 different cases in which what are now gigantic flightless birds independently lost the ability to fly, came from common ancestors that were able to fly, and would have had the potential for flying from one landmass to another or spreading by flight. So it's a totally different view of the likely history of how these birds got to where they are today, which had been so puzzling and which really contradicted the geological evidence of the distribution of land. And this is an example of what we can learn from working out the phylogenetic tree, the family tree of relationships among different groups of birds. Okay, I'm really just about done. So of course, here we're talking about the deep time, going back into deep time. A whole lot of evolution going on, that much of which we'll never be able to recover because, especially all the various extinct things that we may not ever find any evidence of. But sometimes we do, and that's where paleontology comes in. And so I just want to point out that paleontology, together with phylogeny, tells us about some really radical changes, in the history of bird distributions, which account for how birds are distributed today. So I gave an example of how birds must have, these birds must have flown from one landmass to another and account for their geographic distribution. Here's another case. Okay, so back in 2004, I subscribed to the journal Science, and in 2004, the weekly issue arrived, and I looked at the table of contents, and I read the title, Old World Fossil Record of Modern Type Hummingbirds. And I said, what? There are more than 300 species of hummingbirds. All of them are American, mostly tropical America, quite a few in North America. None of them occur in Europe, or Africa, or Asia, anywhere else in the world. So, what? And Gerald Meyer had found and describes here very accurately a hummingbird from Germany, okay, in the Oligocene, which is about 50 million years ago, something like that. And it turns out, and since then, some other fossil hummingbirds have been found in Europe. Okay? So it turns out that at one time, hummingbirds obviously were very widely distributed. And obviously, extinction plays a big role in explaining their distribution today because they used to be widespread and now they aren't, and now you have to go to America to see them. So, so here is a source of information, obviously, that we wouldn't have, if we didn't have the fossil record. At the lower left is a turaco, one of the group of some of the most beautiful birds you could hope to see. All of them live in Africa. There's a whole family that lives just in Africa. It turns out there are Turrico fossils from North America. I know that before I started reading into this kind of thing. That is wild. So there's been a lot of evolutionary history, and what you can see then is that we piecing together both the history and the processes of evolution from a whole variety of sources of evidence. There's the fossil record. There's the comparative anatomy. There's using DNA sequences to figure out who's related to whom. There's studies of behavior and molecular biology, to try to explain why birds and male birds have crazy coloration and patterns. And so those are examples of what evolutionary biologists do, the kinds of questions that they can hope that they can get at least tentative answers to, and the various methods that are used to study evolutionary processes and evolutionary history. I want to close with the fact that, there's been a lot of extinction in the past, and there's a lot of extinction going on now. And I think the vast majority of scientists who've really acquainted themselves with the issue are convinced that we are at the start of the next big mass extinction. And this one's not caused by an asteroid hitting the Earth. This is caused by human alteration of the environment and in every way. And so we have countless species of birds that are in serious trouble, like this magnificent little spoon-billed sandpiper. If you want to see a spoon-billed sandpiper, you will either have to go to remote parts of Siberia where they nest, or to one or two places in Thailand where you can see them in their overwintering ground. Where you won't see them is where you should be able to see them, which is anywhere along the coast of China. Which is where they require mudflats, tidal mudflats in the winter to feed. And almost all of that kind of coast has been developed in China, and there is no habitat there for spoon-billed sandpipers. So that is certainly one reason why this bird is very seriously threatened. Here are a whole bunch of other threatened species, all of which I've been fortunate to see. And what you see is, at the lower left, the Java sparrow. Okay. The Java sparrow is named for, for Java, right? That's where it lives, right? Not anymore. The Java sparrow is extinct in Java. If you want to see it in its original range, you have to go to one or two little places in Bali, and I actually have seen them there. Otherwise, if you go to Hawaii, you will see plenty of them. Basically, this is a bird that's been extinguished by the cage bird trade, which is really big and very serious in Southeast Asia. And basically it's cage birds that have escaped or been introduced in other places in the world. That's the only reason that we still have Java sparrows. All of those other species at the top have basically been extinguished mostly through deforestation, mostly from loss of habitat. The blue-throated macaw in Brazil, the thick-billed parrot in Mexico, the red-fronted macaw also they're all Mexico. Sorry, not Brazil. At the lower, and of course, what's responsible? Well, you see land clearing there in tropical forest by fire. At the lower right is the Alagoas foliage gleaner, a very unpretentious-looking member of the huge family of ovenbirds in tropical America. The Alagoas foliage gleaner's distribution is in northeastern Brazil, in the state of Alagoas and nearby. I was lucky enough to see this species in 2008. I saw one because I had a very good guide who brought me and a companion to one of the only 2 or 3 places where you could see one, which is tiny little nature reserves, tiny little forest reserves in an ocean of sugarcane. Essentially all of northeastern Brazil is sugarcane. There's no place for a foliage gleaner or pretty much anything else to live there, except in these little patches. And Ciro Albano said, okay, let's go and we'll see, I'll show you an Alagoas foliage gleaner. You may not have another chance to see this bird. And he was right, because in 2018, it was officially declared extinct. And this is what is happening, of course, all over the world in greater or lesser degree. And not just in Brazil or Java or wherever, but in North America. This is a fairly recent publication from people at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology who have used various sources of information to show that since 1970, there's been almost a 30% decline in the total number of North American birds. So here we're talking about abundance of North American birds. About 3 billion birds less now than what you could have seen or what existed in North America in 1970. The middle graph shows a whole bunch of different habitats, with different kinds of birds that live in. And to the left, if the bar points to the left, it means a loss. If it points to the right, it means a gain. And what you see is that except in wetlands, all other habitats, basically the birds have suffered, have been, greatly diminished. Okay, and at the right there's a graph that shows all those red bars are various groups of songbirds, the passeriformes, and all of them except for vireos have suffered decline. So we're talking about really serious issues. And the question that one can ask an evolutionary biologist is, to what extent is it likely that birds will adapt to the various changes that humans are wreaking by adaptation? Now, there's the cage bird trade, there's the loss of habitat, by deforestation or getting rid of grasslands or whatever. There's also, of course, climate change, which is a really big thing, and we know that it is affecting some bird populations very seriously. Okay. And so this is mostly an ecological question of, what's the future of various bird species going to be, given all of these kinds of assaults on nature that humans are wreaking. And what you can ask an evolutionary biologist is, are any of them going to adapt, please? We know that adaptation in some cases can happen rapidly, as the finch adapting rapidly in the Galapagos Islands. But I think my answer to this is that the majority of them will not. Okay. First of all, habitat loss. There's no way that a foliage gleaner can survive in sugarcane, period. And that is going to be true of almost any other bird species. So with sufficient destruction of habitat, whether it's by making grazing land or for cattle or sugarcane or banana plantations or basically replacing all of the North American prairie by corn and wheat, except for little preserves here and there, you can basically say goodbye to pretty much all the birds that live there. And because you simply do not get evolutionary shifts happening rapidly between living in one habitat and living in a very different kind of habitat. That's something that transpires relatively rarely during a bird history and transpires probably quite slowly. So habitat loss, I think, means almost certain doom. And the other line of evidence is that we've seen what happens when you get changes in climate, namely over the last million years, where we've had repeated glacial and interglacial episodes. You know that we live on a moraine that was formed by the most recent glaciers. So everything to the north of us was ice. And of course, we've had a series of glaciations and then retreats of the glacier, and it got warmer and so on. Most species did not adapt to those changes in situ. Of course, they couldn't if they lived in Massachusetts, because birds can't live in ice. But even further to the south, what you see is basically species shifted their range. They tended to stay with their environment. And if their environment moved south, meaning a warmer environment with certain kinds of plants that would grow in a warmer environment, if that shifted to the south, the birds shifted south along with the shift of their environment. And then they shifted back north when it ameliorated and the vegetation recovered in the north. Okay. So basically what that tells us, evolutionary history there tells us that the great majority of species of birds and other things they basically don't simply sit in place and adapt to major climate changes. They by and large tend to follow their climatic niche, as it said. And those changes were much, much, much slower than the change in climate that humans are causing today. And so I think for the great majority of species, if they're not physiologically tolerant of changes in temperature and especially changes in water availability and aridity, that is what's probably even more important than temperature, because as you get a more arid kind of environment, number one, the plants are all going to change. Number two, that means a lot of big changes in the insect composition. Number three, It means change in the availability of both nesting habitat and different kinds of food, and just whether or not birds will live in that kind of habitat, as opposed to being programmed to find a forest. So we're talking about very, very serious threats to biological diversity in the future. But having said that, we have to have at least a little tinge of optimism. That there's going to be a lot that we just can't say. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that we're totally helpless and that we can't do anything. Okay? And there are success stories. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a red list of highly endangered species. And one of my colleagues in my department at Stony Brook is an important figure in compiling that list, judging whether or not a species should join that red list of highly endangered species. He tells me they're now actually building a list of recovering species, and most of those recoveries are
due to conscious efforts on the part of people like us to basically advocate for the preservation of habitats, advocate for reducing fossil fuel consumption and slowing down climate change. And there are success stories. These macaws, which I saw in Brazil, are protected. They're still threatened because their main food source is a kind of palm that has nuts that they eat, and the palms tend to be cut down. But at least they are now protected, and very actively protected, and they are thriving for the moment. On the right is a crested ibis, which at one point had been extinguished down to a handful of individuals. They were brought to China. They were then basically had a captive breeding program that increased the total numbers, and they were released then both in China and in Japan. And there are places now where you can go and count on seeing them. And there are many other cases like this. And so I end with saying that that although an awful lot of the future looks very bleak indeed on many fronts, and especially the environmental front. Although the future looks very bleak indeed, it doesn't have to be completely hopeless. At least here and there are rays of light that we can shine or expand and focus. If we engage in educational activities, if we contribute to various kinds of environmental organizations, some of them bird-related, some of them more general, like the Nature Conservancy or World Wildlife, there are all kinds of things we can do, whether it's a matter of a few dollars a year or getting engaged with local environmental groups or educational programs. And I think everyone has, in one way or another, a talent or a resource that they can bring to bear on the issue of trying to do something to save some parts of the diversity, the wonderful diversity of the living world. Thank you very much for your very long attention.
Okay, well, someone was standing up in the back, but I guess I got there first because I'm a winner. That's not for selection. Okay. So most of us with a background of, having passed high school biology know that the basis for determining speciation is whether or not two individuals can mate and produce fertile offspring. But at the same time, with your example of the black-bellied seed cracker, is that the English name for P. ostrinus? Yes. As well as swallows having totally different physical characteristics depending on whether they're found in America. I could have done that if I'd had less coffee. Right. So even though we've got sort of the baseline idea that two different species are determined when two individuals can't produce fertile offspring, your presentation was full of different examples of birds evolving to fit vastly different niches. So as an evolutionary biologist, why would you say that we're still considering all these birds to be in the same species? Is it just because they can still produce fertile offspring, or is there a more complicated reason? Right, like why aren't we counting the American barn swallows and Eurasian barn swallows as different yet? They are.
Well, on cadence, okay. Right. One of the issues that there never will be full agreement on is exactly what we should call species. And there are actually two issues here. One is, what do we think species are conceptually? What do we want the word species to mean, shall we say? What's our concept of what a species should be? And then the second question is, once we have such a concept, once we've established sort of a theoretical definition of species, then comes the question of whether any particular case fits that definition so that we could clearly say whether this population is a different species from that one. So now, so there are, and these are both really contentious issues. So at this time, there are two species concepts that are battling for supremacy, shall we say. The one that I grew up on and which I advocate is the position that people who are interested in processes of evolution tend to advocate, and that is the notion that species are sets of populations that have the potential for freely exchanging genes, the potential for producing offspring, and they, as opposed to being what's called reproductively isolated by some biological difference. And that could simply be that they don't like one another, they won't mate. They might be able to have perfectly healthy offspring, but they just don't. So that's a biological species concept. That is very difficult to apply in cases like those barn swallows, in Europe having white bellies and in North America having red bellies. Because they say, well, would they mate with one another if and have healthy offspring? Well, we don't know without actually caging them. But even in cases like that, we know that can really be misleading. Just because you can produce a hybrid in a lab doesn't mean it would happen in nature. Okay. The other species concept has been increasingly adopted by taxonomists, because their job really is to give us lists of species, to basically, define them. And so they have tended more and more to a more, in some sense, operational definition, in which they say, if two populations are distinguishable by some criterion, now, and then the question is, what's the criterion? If they're distinguishable, then we will call them different species. So my friend and opponent, Joel Craycraft, an ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History, as far as he's concerned, those barn swallows would be different species. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know, because I don't know if they would interbreed or not. There are ways in which you might have surrogate information, like, for example, what if you presented European barn swallows with individuals that had reddened breasts? You artificially made their breast more red. Would they say yes or no to them? So you may be able to do experiments like that could give you a strong indication. But until that's done, you can kind of say, well, all right, if Joel wants to call them different species, who's to say no, right? Because they are different. Right? So that's the beginning of a very long answer, but we don't have time for the very long answer. Right? Yeah. So the question is, while we might be able to save a species that's become very rare and is on the brink of extinction, like the crested ibis, what about its genetic diversity? Because what you're thinking, and rightly so, is that the ability of that population, even if it persists thanks to our intervention, the ability of that population to persist in the face of any kinds of other environmental changes depends perhaps on their ability to adapt. And adaptation requires that there be genetic variation, that there be some mutations or whatever in the population that happen to be useful in dealing with that environmental change. And that is a really good question and a really important question. And the answer is, if your entire species has been reduced down to a handful in one population, there's not much you can do to augment it. Okay. If, on the other hand, you have several populations widely distributed of an endangered species. So you have several little populations that you just save just before, they're on the brink of extinction, but you save them. In that case, they're likely to have some genetic differences among them. So collectively, they would have perhaps a fair amount of genetic variation. And we can then consider, for example, introducing some individuals from one population to another in order to augment the population, the diversity, the genetic diversity in that recipient population. This has been done in a number of cases. There's one that I use in my textbook, which is a species of snake, the adder, a small, venomous but not very dangerous snake in northern Europe. And a population on an island there was clearly dwindling, and clearly it was in ill health, so to speak. It was undergoing what's called inbreeding depression, and very few surviving offspring were being produced. And what they did was to introduce just a few male adders from another population on the mainland of Sweden. And within 1 or 2 years, what they saw was a large number of healthy surviving offspring. And that recipient population then really rebuilt and is basically doing just fine as a result of this genetic augmentation. And so that, so I think that answers your question. If you're down just to one last little population of whooping cranes or small number of individuals of one population of whooping cranes or crested ibis or whatever, well, obviously you can't do that, and you just have to hope that they don't have to face any major environmental challenges.
First off, I want to really thank you, Brett, for restarting a Reigniting Science Night Live. I think there's nothing better than live science lectures, and I've been a huge fan of these. So thanks again. I have a question, and proof that ingestion of caffeine has high survival value. Definitely an adaptation. So my question deals with with the light you've thrown on flightlessness, and with the light you've thrown on flightlessness, like of flightless birds. Yeah, because I go back to the idea of a geographic speciation or geographic isolation as being the mechanism for broad speciation among the flightless species. Now, you elucidate that flightlessness, or rather, flight took place before the divergence of the land masses. But does that necessarily? I see, but. Right. 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 But with the continuing divergence, can we not still talk about geographic isolation once they are removed to these far-flung places in the what would ensue is reproductive isolation. thank you. Thanks for that validation. I don't have to rewrite those slides. But the other thing is, I would ask two other questions. One is, does flightlessness, is that the same recognizable mutation in all of these species?
A good question. Whether in all of those different ratites that became giant and flightless birds, was it like the same mutations that were causing the reduction of the wings? And of course, you have to also add in most cases, the increase in body size, right? And the answer to me is that we don't know. That there's, as far as I know, there's been no analysis of that, and that would be extremely difficult because characteristics like body size and something like the development of the wing are the product of a lot of different genes. Okay? More than 200 different genes contribute to the differences in height among people, like in this room. Okay? And so characteristics like that are genetically really complex, and it's really hard to pin down just which genes would be, have a major role in a major evolutionary change. Probably in each case, it's a number of different genes contributed, let's say, to reduction of wing size or to increase in body mass. But there's no reason to think that they would have been the same genes in each of those different lineages. Now, having said that, I just learned over this past week that of a paper that came out last year, which is really interesting because I and a co-author in the process right now of revising the textbook that Brett alluded to. And I wrote this chapter on macroevolution, and one of the things I said was that big evolutionary changes don't stem just from single big mutations, but rather they're the consequence of the accretion of a number of smaller effect mutations that build. And my co-author said, well, actually, I just found this really interesting paper about the loss of the external tail in the hominin apes, which include humans. So, so we as embryos, we have a tail, as you probably know, a very short tail. And that persists as our tailbone, several fused bones, the coccyx. But we don't have an external tail, unlike all the other primates, most of the other primates, most of the macaques, the monkeys. And of course, this lack of external tail is a characteristic of all the apes, including humans. And it turns out that this can be traced. This is just I was astonished. This can be traced to a single mutational change in one particular gene, and it has to do, if any of you know about transposable elements, this one called ALU, A-L-U, and there are many, many copies of it in the human genome as well as most other genomes. And it turns out that there's an insertion of for those of you who know, excuse me if you don't know this lingo, but a few people do. There's an insertion of an ALU in one exon of a particular gene, which is instrumental, known to be instrumental. It's been known to study the consequences of mutations in this gene cause loss or reduction of tail. And there's an insertion of this short little DNA sequence into one intron, and it then loops around and pairs up with another intron, and exerts, just to say a coding region, basically. Those of you who don't know what exons and introns are, just let me say that basically this is one mutation in which a chunk of a very important gene gets deleted, and the result is that very important gene, tail development, doesn't operate. You don't get the tail.
Thanks.
Hi. I thought it was really interesting that you chose to do this lecture a lot on birds, and sorry, I can't pronounce it. But I also think it's really interesting that a lot of your research focuses on insect to plant relationships and things like that. I'm sorry to bring it up when we were talking about birds and things like that, but I wanted to know, is there anything at all involving like that kind of like co-evolutionary like relationships with that you wanted to bring up for Darwin Day and all for this lecture?
So again, the issue of masks gets in the way. Again, you're asking if there are any examples of co-evolution in birds?
I mean, I was sorry to bring this up, but I said I know that a lot of your research focuses on insect and plant relations, and I was wondering, was there any like examples of like co-evolutionary relationships involving that you wanted to bring up as well, even though we're talking about birds and things like that?
Well, okay, so, that could get into a very large topic, and
Sorry.
And it's late, and I'm sure a lot of people have, they want to get home or have dinner or something. Coevolution is a great big topic. It basically is the idea that you have two or more species that each evolve in response to the other. One way or another, there's a mutual adjustment. Now, one of those could be, for example, the carrier displacement. In the case of the grebes, that's one part of coevolution, right? One of those species evolved in response to competition from the other. Okay, if the other had also responded, then we would have coevolution. Two, it takes two to co. But in birds, probably the best examples are in the brood parasites. I talked about the cuckoo and the birds that it parasitizes. And there is study in Africa, not with cuckoos, but with the cuckoo finch, which is a brood parasitic finch in Africa. And some evidence that, again, that the color patterning of the egg has been co-evolving between the parasite and at least one of its hosts. And so, and what it amounts to is, if the parasite lays an egg which is a perfect mimic of the host egg, then it would, and so the host can't tell, is this my egg or not? Then it would be advantageous for genotypes of the host that lay a mutant egg, which is covered differently. Then those females will be able to recognize their own egg. So if they see a picture with an egg that does look like that, they can toss it out. And so you get the advantageous, and you get the recognition of the new color pattern. But then, of course, in the case of the parasite, it would then be incumbent on females to the parasites to lay eggs which are better matched to the new version of the host egg. And so there's been, I think, a little bit of evidence that both of those may be happening in the case of the cuckoo finch and its hosts.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'll come up. There, you're welcome to come up and ask a question personally. We have the books. If anybody's interested in purchasing a copy, I read it, and it's a wonderful wonderful book using birds to explain just about every type of evolution you could possibly imagine. So let's just one more round of applause for Dr. Futuyma.
Sorry, this